Welcome back to Media7, where we're discussing Internet NZ's NetHui conference about where we're heading online. Now, with the possible exception of Major League Baseball, there is no sphere that loves numbers more than the Internet. In this week's Source, Sam Mulgrew has some big ones.
The growth of the Internet can be hard to grasp. There are more than 2 billion of us online, 1/3 of the planet. That's an increase of nearly 500% in the past decade. African connections grew 2,500%. Just 1 in 100 net citizens are in Australasia, but in terms of per capita usage, we're up there. Globally, 210 million domain names have been registered, nearly 500,000 of those under .nz, which grew 10% last year. But there's a gold rush coming to the web in top-level domain names, or TLDs. They currently come in 2 flavours, the .com, .net variety, and country code TLDs like .nz and .uk. And this one you'll recognise if you've ever shortened a URL. Yes, .ly is the country code for Libya, just as .co is Colombia, and .tv is Tuvalu, which receives $4 million annually for the use of its country domain. But it's all about to explode. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers recently voted to let anyone with $185,000 apply to create their very own TLD. It'll get lively at the World Intellectual Property Organisation, where the current 4,000-odd annual domain name disputes are bound to blow up once you or I could buy .ExxonMobil or perhaps .bank. It all sounds like another great opportunity for someone to put a new wing on the chateau.
So, Vikram, as we mentioned before the break, .everything, unlimited top-level domains. What do you think the impact will be on Internet NZ and the .nz domain? Does it make it that much more competitive?
It does. So the change is that you can take any word and in any language and any script. So that's a big change globally. For New Zealand, it'll still be predominantly English, but the amount is very high. $185,000 is simply the application fee if everything goes well. Every time there's an objection, add a few thousands. So we'd estimate that it'll probably take about $500,000. At that scale, you're probably talking about a small number of, I would imagine, corporates. So, for example, .Fonterra makes a lot of sense, but .Wellington doesn't. It's just too small.
Will there be a wave of disputes?
Yeah, so they've thought about this quite a bit, particularly around trademarks, because that's where all the disputes tend to happen more and more. So they've got a really good system coming up in place where, for example, if Canon, the real Canon, wants .canon, they'll get it and no one else. So they've thought of that quite a bit, but I suspect that a part of that 185,000 is for a lot of that disputes.
Alan, if we could go back to the Internet is for everyone, I thought one of the really interesting things that came out of the first morning of the conference was from the World Internet Project survey, which Internet NZ helps fund. That tracks demographics quite admirably. It doesn't track disabled users. Is that likely to change? Because that seems a very important group to track.
There was a lot of discussion on it in the session, and I think there'll be some follow-up engagement. But one of the main points I think that came out of the session with the World Internet Project is the need for research and the value of research for the internet and understanding access and people's use, and the disability sector is one that was very vocal and engaging in that session. So I'm hopeful that there'll be some follow-up.
I thought one of the other interesting things that came out of that survey was that, as you might expect, some groups, Maori and Pacific Islanders, are a little slower getting online. But once they do, they pile into social networking services. It seems, culturally, they love it.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting bits you can pull out of that research, and certainly the differences in ethnicity around things we looked at today, valuing how important is it in your life, where do you access information, and there were certainly some differences there. I think one of the things, though, talk about access, is that age, particularly the older you are, the less you're accessing the internet, and income. The less you have as income, you're likely to not have access. Those were real issues as well. So.
Because we now talk about the internet as being a human right, as being a component of citizenship. Does that mean that basically in order to be a citizen, either now or very soon, it's going to be necessary to be connected?
I think we're at a point where the power of the internet has really, it's changing our society. And the way that we have operated, processes of commerce, of governance and business are changing. So for example, within government, a lot of democratic sort of participation and other functions takes place online or primarily online. And so not being connected then becomes a real disadvantage. It's not just an advantage to be online, but a real disadvantage to be offline.
And Colin, you, for your sins, were in right at the beginning of that process. You helped create the first government website, which was pretty much a skunkworks at the time, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, well, at the time, I didn't have much. Nobody knew what the web server was. That's not true, of course. I did. A few others did, but I was working in a government department, and in theory, the way to go about getting resources in a government department is you go and ask the right people, and you ask your ID department. And I didn't like my chances of getting them to set up something called a web server when nobody had ever heard of one. So I sort of did a deal with the local university, Victoria, down in Wellington, who understood the web very well but didn't have access to the government, and between the two of us we managed to construct something that was a pretty fair fist at a government website. These days, of course, it looks, by today's standards, it was grey on grey and would look terribly amateurish. But then,
well, all websites did back then.
Well, this is true, and then it was quite groundbreaking. We may well have been one of the first places. The US was before us, but we were certainly up there.
And one of the things that strikes me now, and it's the evidence of how much things have changed, is that to some extent the radicals are inside the tent. You look at someone like Lawrence Miller, the former State Services chief, who, I think some people would see him as an internet anarchist. He's no lover of copyright. He has all the time in the world for WikiLeaks. That's an interesting development, isn't it?
The internet's been that way, hasn't it? Because if you go back about 10 years, everybody on the internet was some kind of libertarian. You remember those days? Yes. It was all about, oh, government's awful, keep government out of the internet. Now, some of those same people were back a few years later begging government to regulate against spam because they come across a problem in human behaviour that they couldn't regulate without the law. So suddenly there was a realisation that we don't actually live in cyberspace, we live in the real world, we have to eat, we have to have buildings over our heads, and the internet is really, really amazing thing to have, but you actually do need those other things as well.
And Vikram, this is where Internet NZ has played a role almost since it took on its current identity in lobbying on policy. I was intrigued to see Rod Drury in the opening address talk about Sky Television, and in his view it needed to be reined in. Is having an opinion on that within the purview of Internet NZ?
We have an opinion on everything. So the Commerce Commission's having a look at the moment. We'll see what they come up with. But quite clearly, when we get fibre and fast broadband, we need something to do with it. And content, whether it's movies or music, is going to be really important.
Alan, what do you hope to see out of the conference?
Collaboration. I really think, there are so many areas that need to come together in terms of expertise, the numbers, the pipe, and content, people communicating. So it's really about collaboration.
There's certainly a lot of talk going on from the conference. Colin, you mentioned the libertarian culture of the internet.
Oh, yes.
And the idea that things are self-organising. And there is evidence of that in the history of the internet. There's also a hierarchy. There is authority on the internet. We've been told in a recent prominent BBC documentary, Adam Curtis's All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, that this doesn't work. The computers are leading us down the wrong path. Self-organising networks don't work. I know you saw that. What did you make of that?
Well, apart from the fact it was an amazing 3-hour documentary that could have been done in 1 hour, though I really liked his analysis about the whole libertarian thing. I don't think he's right in saying that the self-organising network doesn't work. I think largely it has worked. It's not perfect. Most things aren't. But I think the important thing to remember is the network is a network of machines. Machines are not people. the internet is precisely useful because it enables people to talk to each other. So you're left with the internet facilitating all kinds of behaviour, much of which is really good and some of which is quite bad, which might have gone on anyway, but on a much smaller scale. So what we're doing now as a global society is trying to adapt to that, and we're trying to, in some cases, rewrite our laws and our norms of behaviour to deal with the fact that, hey, this stuff that's coming over the internet doesn't come from New Zealand. In fact, we may not even know where it comes from. We still have to figure out how to deal with that in a legal sense.
And we can't even tax it either.
No.
Vikram, there's one story I want to get in just before we go. You're showing another BBC documentary at the conference, the BBC's The Virtual Revolution. How did you get the rights to show that? Because there's a story there, isn't there?
There is indeed. I went to the BBC in UK, and they said, oh, sorry, we're not yet ready to release it in New Zealand. And I said, I'm willing to pay for it. How much do I have to pay? And they said, sorry, we don't want your money. If you have an iPlayer, we can watch it for free. But
it doesn't work in New Zealand.
It doesn't work in New Zealand. So we went to TVNZ7 and said, can we have it? And they said, no, we have only a license to broadcast. So we couldn't pay any amount of money to get the broadcast rights. And we told TVNZ7 we'll do anything. And they said, we'll change, TVNZ changed that entire programming for the week to show it next on Friday.
We were happy to help, I must say. Thank you, Vikram Kumar, Alan Strickland and Colin Jackson. Now, before we go, a little look at when things online are not as they seem. It was way back in 1993 that a Peter Steiner cartoon for The New Yorker gave us the phrase, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. These days we've come along a bit to, on the internet, no one knows you're a creepy middle-aged guy pretending to be a lesbian. So the brave blogger, a gay girl in Damascus, turned out to be not this slender young woman, but a chubby straight Scotsman called Tom McMaster. While we were digesting that, it emerged that Paula Brooks, editor of the popular blog Les Get Real, was actually 58-year-old Bill Graber. And just to really mess with your head, the sexy lesbian personas of McMaster and Graber actually flirted with each other online. We don't have anything quite that odd, but it bears noting that one of the great fakes was pulled by a New Zealander, actor Jessica Rose, who fooled the world into thinking she was video blogger Lonely Girl 15, owner of the most subscribed channel on all of YouTube. Kiwis, we can fake it with the best of them. At which point I feel bound to disclose that I am in fact Sarah Daniel. And that's our show for this week. Thanks again to our panellists and to you for watching. We'll be back with Media7 at the same time next week. Until then, goodbye.